Here we are. We're live, and this is the second Straight Up Craft Dev Day. The topic today is forms, roots, and patterns. I'm Ben Friesick from Barrel Strength Design and StraightUpCraft.com, and I'll be sharing my screen a bit along with Selvin Ortiz, who will be sharing a lot of his knowledge here too. The structure of this is an open conversation, so feel free to jump in with questions along the way. If you're on the outside world viewing this on Google, you can see the number of people in the room, and if it reduces, feel free to join us. All right, so with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Selvin, and he's going to get us started discussing routes and the rest of what we'll be talking about today.
All right, so this might be a topic that everybody is probably familiar with, but I kind of wanted to set kind of a foundation for people that may be watching this at a later time as to what routes are, especially as it applies to MVC architectures. And I'm going to start sharing my screen here because I've got an example. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is one of the most basic things that you see when you're trying to find out what routes are and what they do, and everybody here is familiar with it, right? Pretty much. Anybody that isn't familiar with it? Well, anyways.
Give us an overview.
Sure. Basically, you know, the only thing, this is self-explanatory, but the one thing that you don't see here, it's the actual routing happening. And how you get there. Basically, you know, the browser makes a request and it hits the controller. But in reality, that's kind of the top layer. The real routing happens in a different way, or at least it happens before the controller is hit. And I wanted to illustrate that because I've heard from a lot of people that it's a hard concept to grasp. And, you know, if everything is hidden away, people have a hard time grasping other concepts that are related, like how does craft, you know, resolve actions to controllers, or how is it able to, you know, find out how to route to a template and that sort of thing. So before I get into craft, I kind of wanted to, you know, to make sure I explained a little bit about it. So this is basically a request workflow, but what I'm going to illustrate also is the routing and how it basically works. Let me grab my editor here because I have an example. Let's see.
Except we won't be querying, I mean, in our plugins, I mean, most of the time in the controller, we're not going to be going straight to like an active, well, we might be going to an active kind of record model, but we also, I mean, we're trying to encourage, I think, to use the services more as well. So in between, where it says execution parameters between controller and model, we actually might just be able to communicate with a service instead of straight to the model.
Right. Well, basically, you know, we're not going to be doing the routing ourselves. The reason why I wanted to touch base on this is because a lot of the times when you talk in craft, plugin development, you know, form submissions to controllers and that sort of thing, you oftentimes have to refer to routes, and routes is something that Ben is going to illustrate how it works in the control panel and that stuff. But what I wanted to illustrate is, you know, obviously when routes are set up, you need to create an htaccess file, you know, to make sure that all the requests get routed to the index file, and then that kind of kicks off the process of, you know, let's find the controller that handles this request and so on. So I think that if you are clear on that, then I think it's easier to grasp other concepts. You know, like how to interpret methods from the same request, because you could have a contact form that submits to itself, but it'll have at least two stages, one when it's displayed and the next one when it is processed. So a get and a post obviously could support more, but let me see if I can share my other screen here. So I have, okay, let me increase the size. Okay. So right here I have an index file, and what you guys first, this is the htaccess file, and this is the one that comes with craft, right? And you guys are probably familiar with that. Whoops. So basically, basically this file, just lets Apache know to redirect everything to the index file, and the P parameter with the QSA, which stands for query string append, will basically request the index file and then attach whatever comes after the domain name. But the interesting thing is that, for example, I'm going to pull up a router here that it's okay. This router, there's a lot of code here. But essentially, you can see that the router will actually take care of interpreting the request and then figuring out where it needs to be routed to, and then basically.
Is this router part of CraftSelvin, or this is just a
nope,
generic
this
router?
this is a generic router that a lot of MVC frameworks will use. The idea is that what it does, it captures a request, it parses it, and then it does a lot of different things having to do with routes that Craft itself has defined, or the framework. A typical router might have support for adding methods to it. So you can have something like this router I actually wrote 5 years ago for a homebrew framework, but it supports named routes, and that's going to come in handy because named routes, it's something that Craft uses to get the action for a controller. I could be mistaken, but Kelly can probably tell us a little bit more about that once I get there. So the idea here is that this router will be listening for the request, and the request, when it hits the main page, it will call this function right here. So this router actually supports closures, but it could do a whole bunch of things, and you don't have to have your routes here. It could, basically, it could have them in their own separate file. The main idea is that, in order to understand how routes work, we have an htaccess file that forces all requests to go to the index.php file, and within that file, that's where you usually add a bunch of stuff like your multi-environment configs and stuff. But that's once Craft kicks off, or any other framework for that matter, the request will get parsed, and a lot of information will get stored about it. And then when you actually execute, the router, in this case, when you execute router match, in this instance, it will basically figure out if there is a controller that's associated with that request. And if so, it will basically call that action on that controller. There is no controller actions, being called here, because this is simply, for illustration purposes, it's just a closure. But you could simply, you could also have a bunch of other stuff going on. And the reason I said this simple example is because I want to illustrate a lot of the things that come in handy, like filters and all that kind of stuff. So let me pull up an example here quick, and I'll show my screen in a second. Okay. If I'm going too fast, just let me know. I'm just trying to get through this as quick as I can, and try to make sense of everything that's going on. Let me see. Okay. Okay, let me see. I believe it's... Oh, man. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to find my screen here, and Google keeps making it hard for me. Okay, here we go. Okay, I should be able to do that now. Okay.
So I understand, I mean, there's a great document on the docs for how requests get routed. And
yes.
I mean, it explains the logic of what happens, I mean, inside the basic logic of the router inside Craft. so I don't want to hijack what you're explaining, but there's a number of keywords that we'll check for first inside the path of the URL, which is either actions or I think it's requests, a resource first, and then so I'll let you continue. But so we understand that. I mean, it's just doing matching on the URL, then it's directing it to a place within Craft that can handle that request, whether it be a plugin or not.
Right. So I mean, if everything is being sent to index.php and you capture the URL, you can basically run a bunch of, a lot of logic on it to figure out what you want to, serve to the browser. But the idea is that if you've grasped the basic concept of routes in general, not necessarily as it applies to Craft, if you understand that well enough, it'll be a lot easier for you to, go to the documentation and kind of, figure things out, because a lot of people get confused when they're reading something about a concept they don't understand much about.
Yes.
So the reason I brought that up.
Explaining the general concept of a router instead of for Craft, yeah.
Right. So essentially, the router, when it matches a URL, it will actually, this version, which, a lot of different routers are similar. This one specifically, has a named route. The pattern that was matched, the method that the request was requested through. Basically, parameters will be put there. This is the function that will be called, so there is a closure there. Parameters will go here. So if I actually try to look up contact, there is no route set up for that one, so basically it won't find anything. But it's not too late to do something else. Like at that point you could show a bunch of different things. But right now I'm actually the point of this is it's really not to say that the documentation isn't worth reading or the stuff. It's actually the fact that if a lot of people, because I talk to a lot of people that are actually kind of new to this, and they come in and they get overwhelmed by the fact that they need to understand what controllers are, what templates are, how they get routed, because they see no feasible or no tangible link between templates and the request. You know what I mean? Because a lot of people are used to requesting a resource and having something delivered to them. But if you have an understanding of what the routes are, how they get routed, not in the Craft way, but in general, you can go to the Craft documentation and start getting a lot more out of it once you read it. So there's this router specifically supports a bunch of different things, but it's really irrelevant when it comes to if you understand how routes work, how they are being captured and how they can be manipulated and redirected. Then it'll be easier to understand when you submit a form, what does it get submitted to, and how does it get interpreted, what's the fallback plan. So that's kind of the idea of going through this kind of basic analogy of routes, or kind of a study of routes in general, because a lot of the times you'll get this kind of controller model, the model view controller charts in the request, but really behind the scenes it's kind of like a black box. So a lot of you guys are very familiar with this concept, so it doesn't apply to you as much as people that might be just getting started. So the idea is when that request hits the htaccess file, everything goes to index.php, and then the framework, in this case Craft, would take over and run a bunch of logic on it to figure out what it needs to deliver, whether it's a controller action, a template, or something else. So really that's what I had in actions. I had other examples, but really I think that we all kind of understand the concept. So I'm going to put it back to Ben. I think he's got a couple of things to share.
Okay, cool. I think Luke, to tie it back to that doc page, I think what I'm going to show now is an example of just the basic routes in Craft. So I think we're talking, actually, maybe it's worth pulling up the doc page real quick.
Might need to click on you.
I gotta. Yeah. Let me click on. I gotta share my screen here. Oh, does everybody see that awesomeness? Okay. Did that go away?
It's very meta.
Did it go away now?
Yeah, it's gone.
Okay. I don't have two monitors today, so I can't look at myself in the mirror. All right. So here's the doc page, how requests get routed, and when we were talking about that first step in the process is step 0, where we hit the htaccess file, or we hit the server, and if nothing's there, we get routed to index.php, and index.php gets past the request and where we're going. Then we go through these requests. Is it a resource request? Is it an action request? Is it an entry request? And these are all things that Craft start to handle. So,
and I'll just point out on the action request is the note there where it checks to see whether it doesn't just look to check to see if the word action or actions, depending on what you've set up in your action trigger in the config, but it checks the an actions param or an action param in the query string, so you could pass. I mean, you could go to a URL, any URL in the system, even if it's, I suppose, if it's an existing like path to an entry or something. But if you had an action param on the post request, then it would get routed to whatever had registered. Well, for example, in your plugin, if you had registered a route, or you've got a controller action, it would resolve to that controller action, no matter what the path requested. Is that right?
that's how I understand it. Let us know, Brandon or Brad, if we're interpreting it wrong.
Yeah, they're on mute.
Okay. And I can't see them if I'm sharing my screen. So, okay, all right. So in the case of the action, we're looking for something in the URL that matches the word action, and then if it's Craft specific, it would get directed to the right Craft action, and if it's plugin specific, it would get directed to the right plugin.
Yeah, and what I found interesting though, and I haven't fully tested this, but even if you had registered an action and you passed the action param and it went to your controller, if you didn't resolve the request and return like a template, it would continue through to the router's request after your controller does its thing. So in a way, you could do a bunch of stuff on the request. I'm not sure how much of the request you could modify, but you could do some things in the background on the request and then let it resolve through to, say, one of the lower things like an entry or a template, I believe, which I think is kind of handy.
That's correct. And the point of that is, in the event that you're trying to do something like save an entry or anything that might require validation, it allows you to add validation errors to the entry model or whatever it is, save that entry model in the URL manager so that it's ready to pass it back to whatever template would ultimately get loaded, and then basically just let Craft continue on, and then when the template is reloaded, it's already got this entry model in place full of validation errors, basically.
Yeah.
And we're going to get in a bit to handling errors and stuff. We'll be looking at examples if we want to talk about that a little more later. Okay, so next is it an entry request? And this is specific to entries in the system. And then I guess next is where the example I'm going to start out with is, does the URI match any dynamic template routes? And so Craft has so
It's like a router in a router.
Yeah, when we come to a page, let's say we click on news here, we're passing news to the page, and that if it matches the template file in the folder, so if we're in our templates folder, we have a news template here, and we have an index file. If that matches a file that exists, it's going to return that page. However, if we start clicking on the specific entry, we see that more segments are passed to the page here and passed to the router. However, we don't have exactly that file in our folder structure. So at first glance, we might not know where that's going. And Craft provides a pretty neat way to start dealing with that at first. So right in our settings page here, when you install everything by default, you're going to find a system routes file, and we'll see right now that no routes exist. So at first we might go like, why we're passing URL strings that don't exist in our templates. However, there's also no routes that exist in the system. So where is that happening? And so we can take a look at our sections, and in our news section, we've selected in the news section, or it comes selected by default, that entries in this section have their own URLs. And this is the prior step in that how requests get routed when the page load. And we're setting the route for our section here. And so news requests are going to get routed to this location, or URLs that match this location get routed to this underscore entry template in our folder, that file, and we know which file to edit or which file to build out to match that request. So
it would be cool on the routes page if you could see all the other routes in the system that have been set up. So like, because if you're building a route and you decided to build a route called news / like a number, for some reason it would conflict with other routes in the system, so you'd have to know all the other routes that exist for all the other element types or entries or sections, throughout the system. So it'd be cool eventually one day you could have a central location for all the routes in the system.
It might be worth noting that URL format setting isn't technically a route.
Okay.
So that previous step in the how requests get routed workflow is basically Craft's just seeing if any entry has a URI that matches the request URI. So if you were to look at the database in the elements underscore I18N table, you would see that every single entry has a static URI that it has registered for itself. And including that URI was generated through or via that URL format setting, but it wasn't. But the URL format setting isn't factored in during the actual per request routing process, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So the URL format setting is kind of a template for defining what entry URIs are going to look like. But when it comes to actual routing, all that Craft's concerned with is, hey, does any entry match this URI that they passed? So there's no central place where, well, there's a central routing location if you're creating dynamic routes, but the URL formats you're entering aren't part of that.
Okay.
It's kind of a similar concept, but it's
you're saying in the database, when you've saved this as news post date year slug, you're generating a static. You're grabbing the year from each of the entries and storing that, and grabbing the slug from each of the entries and storing that.
Yep.
And then you're just matching it on the whole
Right.
the route.
So by the time that it's actually being factored into the per request routing, it's just a static thing. It's just, are there any rows in this table where the URI column matches the path in the request?
And I assume, Brandon, that there are two situations in which that happens. One, when you save the entry itself, it generates the URI. But when you save the section settings, does it have to go through every entry? And
Yeah, it does. So,
Okay.
you know,
Interesting.
it's a big process, and
So
I'm
you
sure-
kind of are setting up a route, but you're matching it against a static kind of string.
yeah, it's kind of like each entry gets its own little route that doesn't
Mhm.
have a dynamic URI. It's just a static string. So you could kind of think of it like that. Like if you have
Yep.
1,000 entries, you've actually got 1,000 routes. It's a little more efficient than that since it's a simple, indexed query
Yep.
against one single table in the database. But you could think of it that way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So these variables, we actually see them right here in the database in the craft underscore elements underscore I8 or I18N folder or table. All right. Everybody knows you don't want to see me live coding or trying to do what other people are describing on this, but trying to connect the dots if people are watching this later. So, okay, so now let's say we go back to our front end here, and we've just understood how that entry is finding itself in the database. And what happens when we start wanting to do things that aren't supported by that each entry has its own URL? So, for example, at the top level here, I've created a quick, dirty example of an archives functionality. So here we have all the posts in the system, and we're outputting them by year and the number of posts per year. And if I click on 2012, I'm going to get taken to a. We'll troubleshoot this together.
I think you hadn't credited a route yet.
Yeah. So I get taken to archive/2012, and a 404, and that's the correct thing we should be seeing because that template doesn't exist here. We don't have an archive folder with a 2012.html in it, and Craft doesn't know what to do, so it's giving us its 404 page. Now, if we want to solve this problem, we can create a route. We know that that's the format of our archives page, and we're going to create a route. And this is about the coolest regex. Can we call this a cool regex interface? Is that fair to say?
String builder.
So we're going to describe what our URL looks like by news archive and then adding the token here year, which is a very human readable form of what we want to happen there, which is a 4-digit segment of the URL. And then when we tell Craft where to load that, and I've created a template in the news folder called underscore archive.html. So if we save that, and now we have a route in the system for Craft, and just to tie that back to the documentation, that's happening right here at number 4. Does the URI match a dynamic template route? We have our route, and now if we reload this page, which matches the pattern news archive 4-digit, we get the list of entries that the page is. We get the output of what that template is telling us to output, and I have it outputting the pages by year. So if we go back and go to 2013, we'll see that we get a different set of entries because they're matching this. Are there any comments or clarifications on this so far?
This is just a tiny bit off topic, but Ben, can you go back to the routes where you created a route in Craft?
Yep.
Yeah, so I had thrown this up on the message board, and I don't know if it actually went anywhere, but is there going to be a way eventually to duplicate a route? Because I find situations where I'm actually creating very similar routes, and so, it would be awesome if I could just hit duplicate route. It comes up with basically a copy of what's in there. I change one word in there, and I save that, and I now have a very similar route that goes to a different place. Is that something that you guys have planned?
Yes, I.
Well, I'll let you guys answer, but we're going to give a demo of doing this in the file next, I'll say.
Yeah, I like it in the file. In fact, I actually turned to that when they started really stacking up. I turned to the file because it was much easier for me to duplicate it there. So I mean, whatever the answer is, I'll get over it.
I
Don't
just
be lazy, Lindsay.
I just added it to the list, Lindsay.
Awesome, thank you, much appreciated.
All right. Well, yeah, and so I guess, yeah, if you want a quicker way to manage it right now, we'll show the next step here, which is, so this is routes in Craft, and it's a very user-friendly way to manage this, and very elegant execution. If we want to do this another way, though, we like working in text editors or just having a little more access to what we're doing. We just love regular expressions, things like that. The next place to go with this is to override the routes in the control panel and move it to a file. And so by default we have this routes system preference right here, but it doesn't need to be that way. We might not like the icon, or we might want to work. I like the icon, but
my favorite's
right
the packages.
Or the scary plugins one. Scared.
Yeah.
Anthropomorphic little buttons. All right, so in our craft folder we have a config folder, and in that we have a routes.php. By default this file is not in use. Our routes are being managed in the control panel, but if we want to use this routes.php instead of our control panel option, we open up general PHP, which is where we manage our config overrides, and I've copied in here what I'm going to be showing you already, but what's happening, and I'll make it a little bigger, is this file is just returning an array of config settings to Craft, and if you're overriding certain settings, they are going to take priority over the default settings. So by default, we managed routes in Craft's CP, and now we're saying site route source equals file, which means let's use our config routes.php file instead. Now, go back to our front page again. When we go to our order posts by year again, we get a page not found again, and that's because we broke the default implementation in Craft. And if we go back to our settings page now and refresh, we'll see this routes button actually disappears. It no longer exists in the control panel because we can no longer manage things there. If we want to start managing things, we got to open up our new file, routes.php, and we've got a nice little description up here that you can read through to understand how to do this, and even a nice example for how to get started. And once again, I've copied the code beforehand, so I'm just going to uncomment it. But what we're doing here is we're basically taking what we did in that interface before, and we're now doing it in this file, and we get to see what that year token actually is doing behind the scenes, what happens there. And so this route is, the first part of this route is a regular expression, and then the second part of this route is just the URI, or the, I guess, the location of the template file that we will be using to display content. And refresh my page now. Once again, we're directing people to the right place to do things. Now, couple interesting things are
Just point
happening
out-
in this.
sorry.
Go on.
Yeah, sorry, continue. You're probably going to say it. So the year gets passed in as a variable to the template,
Yeah, so this
named year.
the cool thing about what's happening here, and which kind of gives you a little more, yeah, I guess it lets you see what's happening behind the screens, is this is a regular expression, and one of the things that's happening is you need to escape slashes in the regular expression, so we have an extra slash in front of our route there. But what's happening a little farther down, and this was new to me in seeing Craft do this, but this question mark P means that we're beginning a pattern. And after that P, whatever you have in angle brackets is the name of the variable that's going to be available in your template. So whatever pattern is in this area is going to be available in the template by the Craft template token year. So in my template, I'm going to be able to type year and output that segment in the URL. I could also type, what is it? Coding, it's awesome. So that, but because we've created a variable here in the rule, we no longer need to do that. And that what that token matches is actually what comes after it here, and /digit is regular, /d is regular expression speak for digits, and then the curly brace 4 end curly brace means that there must be 4 digits consecutively. So if we rewrote this and removed this, it should still work, and I can test it or make a fool of my. But here I am refreshing the page, and it's still working, but year would no longer be available on our page, a variable.
And do these match in order of declaration? So if you had like the exact same route, but maybe it's matching a 2-digit thing, it would match, or if even a 4-digit one with a different name for a different variable,
so
it would match.
Yeah, one thing we might want to do is say add months to our path. Or have a way to display things by month, and so we do that, adding a second route here, and we might direct it to the same page and handle what's happening on that page differently if we have 4 segments in our URL or only 3. So you can clarify consecutive if that doesn't address what you're speaking of, but I don't know of a way to do kind of multiple options in these routes. I've only found a way to, if you have multiple routes, you kind of need to add multiple rules to direct things.
I mean, I'll have to look at the code. I'm assuming what it does though is it checks each of them in order, one at a time, and then just takes the first match it finds. Is that right? So it starts from top down.
Luke, are you referring to how does Craft take the matches and turn them into variables?
Yeah, I think Is it?
I mean, say if the request comes in for news archive right now, it gets the year. It matches the 4 digits. It therefore stops, doesn't it? I mean, it matches it. Once it finds a match, it follows the request and it doesn't keep going any further. So if you had a
I'm sorry. So you're referring to which route?
Yeah, like if above this, exactly. If above this first route he's showing there, I put a route that's a star or a catch-all.
Yeah,
it would override and wouldn't.
The first route that matches the URL in full is going to be the one that wins. So
yes,
you definitely want to have them in order of most specific to least specific, kind of.
Yes, that's my point. Yep.
Yeah.
So in this example, I'd want to,
in this example, it doesn't really matter because neither one of those has the option to match the other. If your second one with the month, if if you were to throw a little question mark after the end of the month matching subpattern, basically making that entire last part optional.
Optional. Yeah.
After the closing parenthesis, then and if you were to put that first, then basically that second route would never have an option to be matched, because that route would be matching both URLs that have a month and those that don't.
Yeah, so it starts at the top of the array of routes, goes through until it finds a match, then resolves it. So if you had a, what's the syntax for catch-all? I suppose it's just a regular expression that catches all.
So dot star.
Yeah, dot star. Yeah, so if you had a dot star at the very top of that array, it would match nothing below ever.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're talking about doing. Is that right?
Yeah. And Ben, I'm gonna butt in here and just say something that's like totally bugging me. I think back like somewhere during the beta days, we actually updated this stuff so that the URL patterns don't need to have that backslash before each of the forward slashes.
Okay.
And as soon as you pulled this page up, I realized that I didn't update this. So I just did,
Awesome.
and so we'll fix it in 1.1. But yeah, Craft's been smart enough to add those backslashes for a while. So.
But
Awesome.
What about inside the control panel routes you declare in a plugin?
Same thing.
They still
all
need
the
it?
same system.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. In fact, maybe it's worth mentioning that basically the routes you're defining here, they do get handled exactly the same way that the routes that Craft's CP uses and the routes that plugins might add. They're all handled the exact same way, which means that even for this routes.php file, if you wanted, you could have a route go to an actual controller action as opposed to just a template. And you would do that by setting the route value to an array with an action key, which is basically a controller action path.
Nice.
Kind of cool little feature there.
Yeah.
So. Is that what you were saying, Brandon? Or action?
Sorry, my internet kind of cut out there. I missed whatever you asked.
I was trying to
Syntax for a
live code
controller.
what you were saying and not mess it up, but so you see the screen, like if you're saying take that second segment of the route, make it an array, and pass it in action.
Yeah, exactly like that. And then
this would be the name of our function, or
that would be a standard action path. So the same controller name / action name kind of thing. Same type of action path that would be used to define any other action request.
You could write plugin / go or whatever.
Now this would only match GET request. It wouldn't match POST request, obviously, right?
No, it doesn't matter. It'll match either. Craft basically leaves it up to the controllers to choose
require
whether
a part. Yeah. There's a delay.
Right, but what I'm saying is that if your action has required POST,
yes, that would still be applied.